A coffin was opened. Inside, just bricks. One teen never died in that fire. He ran. He watched. What happened next will shake everything you thought you knew. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The first coffin cracked open with a groan that seemed to echo through the soaked ground, as if the earth itself hesitated to reveal what it had hidden for 20 years. Rain slicked the grass in sheets, turning the Breckenridge Cemetery into a field of silent mud. Flashlights cut through the gray dawn like scalpels. What was meant to be a respectful relocation, routine, clinical, had turned surreal within minutes. By the time the third coffin was opened, the whispers had already started. Detective Marissa Hale stood at the edge of the grave, arms crossed tightly, the collar of her raincoat pulled high against the chill. The smell of wet wood and old decay seeped into her lungs, but it wasn't the scent that tightened her throat. It was the absence. Inside the fourth casket, Jesse Calloway's by burial records, there were no bones. No tattered fabric, no trace of a body, just a crude layer of bricks, each stacked neatly like a grim joke. Marissa's mind raced. She'd gone to school with all 4 kids. Tyler had been the golden boy, quarterback and prom king. Rachel, effortlessly kind, adored by teachers and friends. Eli was the loud one, wild but harmless. And Jesse. Jesse had always been a little different. Quiet, offbeat, obsessed with his video camera, always watching, always filming. Back in 2004, the town had accepted the story too quickly. Tragic accident, no suspects, closed case. People had wanted to move on, grieve, forget, heal. Even Marissa, still only 17, had believed it. Until now. The pathologist shook his head, voice low and tense. 3 complete skeletons. No evidence of a 4th. This casket's a placeholder. Someone behind her muttered, "Jesus." Marissa turned away from the grave and stared out across the rows of headstones, her breath fogging in the morning air. Jesse Calloway hadn't been buried. That fact hung in the air like a scream no one could hear. What chilled her more than the missing body was the thought that Jesse, odd, awkward Jesse, might have never died in that fire. Or worse, that someone made sure his death stayed hidden. One of the so-called victims had never been in the ground, and that meant the story they'd all believed for 20 years about what happened that night in the woods was a lie. And lies, Marissa knew, didn't stay buried forever. The confirmation came through just after midnight. Dental records matched cleanly. Tyler Briggs, Rachel Martin, Eli Henderson. The charred remains pulled from the coffins belonged to them. The absence then was undeniable. Jesse Calloway had never been buried. Marissa Hale stared at the report, the fluorescent lights of the evidence lab casting long shadows over her desk. Her fingers drummed against the table, restless, haunted. She had known it in her gut since the moment she saw the bricks. But to see it confirmed, stamped, and sealed in sterile black ink, it was like stepping into a second funeral. Jesse Calloway. She hadn't thought of him in years. His face came back in pieces now. Oversized hoodie, shaggy hair half hiding his eyes, fingers always fidgeting with the record button on that battered handheld camcorder. He hadn't fit. Not in that school, not with those people. He was the kind of kid small towns didn't know how to deal with. Too strange to be embraced. Too passive to be feared. She remembered the way Tyler used to laugh at him. The way Eli would knock his books out of his arms in the hall. Rachel had tried to be kind, but even kindness from someone like her could feel like condescension. Jesse had absorbed it all, silently, always silently, behind the glass lens of that camera. That made what came next even harder to watch. The VHS tape, grainy and warped, flickered in the playback monitor. The date stamp read May 22nd, 2004, the night of the disappearance. The footage was jumpy, erratic. Jesse was filming in the woods, his breathing audible, uneven. Then, flashlight beams, voices. Rachel's voice, pleading. Tyler's voice, slurred and aggressive. Eli laughing too loudly. The confrontation played out like a fever dream. Tyler mocking Jesse, daring him to man up. Eli splashing something from a red gas can. Rachel crying, telling them to stop. Then, Jesse shouting something indecipherable. Then screams. The camera tumbled sideways. Dirt, branches, feet scattering. And above the sudden rush of fire and chaos, laughter, shrill, uncontrolled. But it wasn't Jesse's voice. Marissa froze, replayed it, again, again. That laughter. It wasn't frightened. It was delighted. She paused the tape, staring at the frozen frame. Rachel, eyes wide with fear. Tyler reaching. Flames blooming in the dark. Jesse had filmed everything. He'd confronted them. He'd been there when it all burned. But someone else had taken pleasure in it. And that raised a terrible, pressing question. Was Jesse just a victim? Or had he become something else before he vanished? The deeper Marissa dug, the more the town of Breckenridge began to rot in her hands. She wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. She was exhuming rot beneath yearbook smiles and candlelit memorials, beneath the myth of the prom tragedy that the town had romanticized for 20 years. Every file she pulled, every testimony she unearthed, bled the same truth. This hadn't been a senseless accident. It had been a ritual of cruelty, and Jesse Calloway had been its chosen victim. The school records were full of red flags no one had dared connect. Tyler Briggs had been suspended twice for harassment, though the files never used stronger language. Eli Henderson had a sealed juvenile record, and a long list of altercations swept under the rug by his stepfather, who sat on the school board. And Rachel, sweet, smiling Rachel, had started seeing the school counselor weekly in the months before her death. Her final text, pulled from an encrypted phone backup Marissa recovered through court order, read simply, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have let them. I need to tell someone." She never got the chance. And then came the blow that left Marissa reeling. The DNA sample from the back seat of the burned-out car didn't belong to Tyler, Rachel, or Eli. It was Jesse's. Blood, not enough to suggest death, but enough to scream struggle. She knew what that meant. Jesse had made it out. He had been hurt, yes, but he had run. The scan of the woods turned up more than anyone expected. Deep beneath thick underbrush, where no one had searched in 2 decades, cadaver dogs alerted at a crumbling storm shelter wedged into the hillside like a forgotten wartime secret. The door was rusted shut, nearly fused to the frame. It took 2 hours to pry it open. Inside was a chamber of silence. Dust lay thick on rusted shelves, empty water bottles, expired canned food. In the far corner, a thin mattress decayed under the weight of time. But it was the wall that froze Marissa, plastered with photographs, dozens of them. Jesse's old camera footage, printed, trimmed, and pinned like forensic evidence. Images of Tyler with a cruel smirk, Eli laughing with a beer in hand. Rachel, half-turned, face pale with something between regret and fear. They had become ghosts on that wall. And then, beneath the photos, a body, collapsed in the fetal position. Bones clothed in rags. Decomposition suggested he'd died alone, weeks after the fire. The note was scrawled in shaky, erratic handwriting on the inside of the shelter's door. They lit the fire. I ran. They tried to find me. I locked them out. I survived. But I couldn't survive myself. Marissa stood there in that bunker for a long time. No sound. Just the weight of 20 years of silence pressing down like a final, suffocating breath. And for the first time since the case reopened, she wasn't haunted by questions. She was burning with fury. They hadn't been just bricks. They'd been arranged, perfectly stacked, 3 rows deep, centered in the coffin like a monument no one was ever meant to see. Not a careless substitution, a message, a signal. Jesse hadn't just vanished. He had returned. At some point, maybe days or years after crawling into that underground shelter to die, he, or someone else, had come back to the cemetery, opened the earth, removed his own bones, left the bricks like a riddle written in stone, and someone had covered it all up. Marissa Hale replayed the timeline over and over. Jesse had died alone, but his body had remained hidden for years, and the swap had occurred long before the recent flood, meaning someone had dug up that grave, undetected, nearly 2 decades ago. The answer came from the last person she would have suspected, David Martin, Rachel's father. Old now, gray and shrunken inside his armchair, he hadn't spoken Jesse's name in 20 years. But when Marissa brought him the photo of the bricks, just that, his face cracked. His eyes welled and the words poured out. "I did it," he whispered, almost in relief. "I switched the coffin." In 2005, a battered package had arrived on his doorstep. Inside was a VHS tape and a note in Jesse's handwriting. She tried to stop them. She didn't want this. David watched it once, just once. Jesse had filmed everything. The laughter, the terror, the moment Eli splashed the lighter fluid, the flick of the match, Rachel screaming, Jesse burning, but he hadn't died. The tape showed Jesse staggering out of the fire, crawling into the woods. The camera turned back toward the flames, catching Tyler yelling Rachel's name. David said nothing to the police, nothing to the press. Rachel had begged to let it go. She was going to tell the truth herself, but she died before she could. So, in his private grief, he buried the truth with her. He unearthed Jesse's grave one rainy night, replaced the bones with bricks, hid the real remains in a sealed box in his garage for months, until he buried them quietly in the woods, beneath what became the shelter. "I thought I was protecting her memory," he said, tears trailing down his sunken cheeks. "But I was only protecting a lie." When Marissa made the findings public, the town of Breckenridge mourned again. But this time, they mourned truthfully. Jesse Calloway didn't vanish. He ran. He hid. He tried to survive the fire and the years that followed. But guilt and silence finished what the flames could not. At his second funeral, under a clean headstone marked only with his name, Marissa placed Jesse's old camera gently atop the casket. Not as evidence, but as proof he had lived. And that finally, someone was ready to see him.